Very pleased to be here. I thank Professor Friedman and the rest of the staff that invited me. It's an opportunity that we've searched for quite a few years to find the right dates. It's all very packed and difficult, but we opened up this window and I'm very glad I'm here. What Oli portrayed perhaps can be summarized with the idea of a southern perspective. I think throughout the years and wherever I've been, I try to look at the southern perspective, and this is drawing its inspiration metaphorically from Antonio Gramsci, one of my favorite philosophers, who talks about the southern question and about the perspective and how enriching it is to look at hegemony, look at systems of power from the south, and also from my own geographies, because I've lived in Australia, which is a southern hemisphere, South Africa, and in the Negev, Nakab, in Israel-Palestine. So constantly I'm looking at the world from the south. I ignore the fact that I come originally from the Galilee, which is from the north. So this is where activism and scholarship actually reinforce one another. It's not simple because activism, first and foremost, takes enormous amount of time. To go to legal cases, especially in the High Court, it's enormous amount of work. To write 6 reports for B'Tselem about the regime of the West Bank, it takes a lot of time and it's not sort of academic. But I managed to also translate it to academic publication. It's all up to you to use and evaluate if you like. And the work of ethnocracy, which to some extent conceptualizes what I found in Sri Lanka, in Malaysia, in Lebanon, in Israel-Palestine, in Estonia, in Northern Ireland. And I haven't really worked on the Balkans, but it became very popular among Balkan scholars. So I'm very interested, of course, in this kind of dialogue. Today I will look at Israel-Palestine. That's what I was asked to look. But there will be some theoretical and some comparative touches, and I'll be very interested, of course, in your reaction. So let's start with this. Slide, which are 2 newspapers, one Palestinian and one Israeli, one day after the last elections in Israel in January this year. You see Netanyahu, our prime minister, which interestingly for Israel is the first prime minister to be re-elected, the first one after 25 years. It's very, very rare in Israel for a prime minister to be re-elected. And also by the skin of his teeth. Really, the election was a draw, 50-50. But he managed to create a bloc, a very, very slight majority. But what I want to draw your attention to is the map. Okay, we're dealing with geography. We're dealing with subtle, sometimes shadow kind of geographies that I think tell a whole story that you'll see in a minute to which I refer. So we see the whole land behind it. This is a school where he casted his vote between the Jordan and the sea, as they say in Arabic, between Maya le Maya, from water to water, which is the entire Israel-Palestine, the entire land of Israel and mandate Palestine. And that you might say, well, this is a government school, this is Netanyahu, this is a picture that he wanted. Of course, he's very, very, very savvy media person. He constructs and designs all his media appearances very carefully, and that's what he wanted. But the left-wing Haaretz, too, published a similar map. And look, this is about the election. This is the whole land between the Jordan River and the sea. And yet the election is supposedly only about the sovereign area of Israel, which is in the green line, which is never marked on the maps anymore. It's in the green line, which is sort of a small, proper Israel, recognized by the international community as a state, but its occupation and colonization of Palestine is not recognized. It's considered to be illegal. And yet, of course, the irony is that the election is, one of the central topics in every election is about the Palestinian territories. What will be the future of the Palestinian territories? Only who is never asked? The Palestinians. The Palestinians do not vote. They vote, if they do vote, for a small sort of proxy government sitting in Ramallah or in Gaza. So this is a situation that is very very unusual, unconventional, I call it a creeping apartheid situation. It's definitely a colonial rule. Nobody talks about it. People treat Israel as a democracy, right? Some people, after my work and some other people, treat it as an ethnocracy. But still, this is more severe than ethnocracy. This is a colonial rule that is moving into an apartheid system. And of course, it's very, very important that it has a democratic facade, because democratic facade gives it legitimacy. And people can continue to work and think that they live in a liberal democracy while they're colonizing and creating an apartheid system. And of course, it is not sustainable in the long term. So this is part of my argument. Israel-Palestine is creeping towards an apartheid system. It is undeclared. That's why it's creeping step by step, institutionalizing slowly, and of course, quite disastrous. It's already disastrous, of course, for 60 years in terms of Palestinian rights, but it's also eventually disastrous for Jews. And I want to call, first of all, attention to this process that is rarely discussed openly. Second, to call on you, or Europe in general and Balkan people in particular, to maybe think about it, intervene, talk, air it. And third, also to entertain how we move ahead. And the current work that I do with the Palestinian-Israeli group on Confederation as a possible way out of the trap in which we are in. So let's look at some statements by Netanyahu. 4 years ago, after his famous Bar Ilan speech, which was supposed to be a break, a new sort of beginning, he declared that we have managed to create a national agreement about the concept of 2 states for 2 people as our strategy for peace. That was revolutionary at the time. As it turned out, it was a bunch of, I would say, empty words. But it's continued to be a slogan. Just a couple of months ago, Netanyahu again declared our strategy is 1, 2 states for 2 people. That means, of course, Palestine and Israel. Palestine for the Arabs, Israel for the Jews. This is repeatedly, every so often, they throw up this statement. But one might ask, if Israel actually controls the land, Israel has, not total, but a significant amount of power, why isn't it happening? Of course, the answer is that Israel is not interested in this happening. It's interested in Palestine never actually being established. And increasingly also the Palestinians are not interested in Palestine happening, and this is the dynamic that we are facing now. This is another statement just recently. Netanyahu backs 2 states for 2 people. It is, Becca is here, where is it, Professor Becca? You know, it's a very interesting exercise, Israel-Palestine, in a Foucauldian kind of discourse analysis. How discourse actually is quite removed from reality. Israel is fast settling the West Bank. It's fast colonizing the Palestinians inside Israel. And at the same time, it talks about 2 states for 2 people. So the role of discourse, the cynical role of discourse, Machiavelli couldn't think of a better strategy to do it. But at the end of the day, I would say as an Israeli, this is also disastrous for the Jews. So my plan for this 35 minutes that I've got left is to talk a little bit about the framework of political and legal geography, to give you a chart of the critical analysis of the geopolitics of Israel-Palestine, and to focus on some areas and look at some future scenarios and how, as I said, we managed to get to where we are and maybe to get out. And also here, I would like to stress this again. Israel considers itself good friends of Serbia. It constantly holds Serbia as some kind of an example, both fighting against the Nazis. And with the case of Kosovo, Israel always warns that Gaza and the West Bank is like Kosovo, and very much sympathetic with Serbia, didn't recognize Kosovo. So you could think about the other way around, that Serbia can influence Israel. And Serbia can come and put its weight, and with all the disasters happening that occurred here in the 1990s, to warn Israel from this kind of situation, which is both the cruel and savage partition that happened here, and with all the ethnic cleansing, but also with the attempt to control and colonize other peoples, which Serbians learned the hard way, that is virtually impossible on the 21st century. And Israel is trying to do a greater Serbia now. Israel is actually doing it. It's trying to control our Kosovo, it's trying to control our Srpska, it's trying to control all the regions in Croatia that were Serbians, and it's powerful enough to continue to do that, but it's weak power. It's not sustainable power, and the Palestinians are not giving up, and this is where I think Serbia and the Balkan people can share their experience and try and influence Israel rather than support it blindly, as so far has been done. Just a note about critical political and legal geography. This is my perspective, and urban geography maybe, as Oli said. And this is investigating the connection, the links between power and space. Two things that, of course, are dynamic, two things that are not ever stable. And the link between them, trying to open up and see how power operates, of various types of power, and how space is active. It's never just a recipient of power, but actually radiates back into power a lot of dynamics, which is, you know, the way to look at things and open them up and actually understand how space influences also human society. And also law. Law and space. Law is taken by people as something, you know, given and sort of above society. But no, law is dependent on space. Space influences law. Law influences space. And sometimes in almost amazing ways, when I represent some of the villages of the West Bank in court, sometimes we draw on 5 or 6 legal systems to try and get a case, like to save a house from demolition, to save, recent weeks, all the Susia in the southern Hebron mountain is declared a military zone, and it's about to be evacuated by Israel. So you have Jordanian law, you have Ottoman law, you have British law, you have international law, you have Israeli law, and you have Palestinian law, all in the same place working together. So legal geography is very important to understand and to open up, allow us to see. For example, it allows us to see the dynamic of creeping apartheid that most people ignore. And when you actually look at that space between Jordan and sea, and look at the type of citizenships and the types of races that exist, so-called races or ethnic groups, the way they're segregated and the way there is no mobility between them and no equality, and the way they have different status under the system that is galvanizing in front of our eyes, you see a situation of separate and unequal. And separate and unequal is the basis of apartheid, right? So without declaring it, actually a geographical perspective allows us to see it and then try to fight against it. So I'd like to chart a course, first of all, that's some of the main points I want to stress. First of all, we need to look historically and geographically at how the political geography of Israel-Palestine progressed. And I highlight different stages on which I'll elaborate in a minute. I'd like to highlight that a key factor that's quite often hidden is the land and settlement system, especially the land system. The land system is critically important. And this is why legal geography becomes very important, because much of the settlement of the land, the colonization of Palestine, or the colonization of many places around the world, Australia, South Africa, India, many places, is done under the auspices of the law. It's supposedly legal, right? The terra nullius concept that Europe has invented, declaring that Africa and Asia and Australia are empty lands, even though people existed there, right? Was an idea that the law actually makes it legal to take the land, and it denies the dispossession, right? So here it's very important to look at the land system, and I'll talk a little bit about it, how it's actually manipulated and makes people, settlers themselves, the colonizers themselves, feel that they are legal. They don't feel that they're doing anything wrong because the legal system has made itself work in favor of the colonizer. So the stages of Israel-Palestine is actually quite a complex situation because it's not straightforward empire that colonizes another land like the French did or like the Belgium did, the Spaniards did, etc., etc. It is actually what I call colonization by refugees. The Jews, let's not forget, and it's very important for the story, they are refugees. They are actually driven into their mythical, biblical homeland. They never actually immigrated there when the land was open. For centuries, during the Ottoman time and before, the land was open. There were very few people living there. But the Jews didn't go there. They went there when anti-Semitism rose, when they were pushed out, first of all out of Europe and then out of the Arab world. Zionism tries to show itself as some kind of return to an ancestor's homeland, and it's only partially true. Basically, Zionism is a movement of refugees, desperate refugees. They had nowhere to go. Even the United States, Britain, in some of the darkest chapters of human history, blocked the way to Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 40s, and they sent them back into the Nazi animal. So in that respect, Israel-Palestine became, after the war and after what happened in the Arab world, where Arab nationalism also pushed, it didn't evict Jews like in Europe, but it pushed Jews out, an asylum for Jews. And they, of course, in their state of mind, it's very important to understand, saw nowhere else to go. And this is, by the way, one of the important psychological explanation of the success of Zionism. Because when you actually try to measure it like a political scientist, you don't think that there is a chance that a group of people will come to a land where they are a minority. Remember, even in 1948, the Jews are the minority. They're only 30% of the population. The Palestinians are 67, 68%. But yet they manage, through various forms, through various help. The help of the British Empire was very important, but basically because they were desperate. They were nowhere to go, and they moved out of a genocide situation. So this has to be taken into account. But for the Palestinians, it matters very little, right? You know, maybe morally you would think that the Palestinians could consider it more. Maybe they could accept the partition plan of the 1947. But for them, it was, they were colonized by an external group that came and took the land, settled, evicted most of them in 1948 during the Nakba. So it's a complex situation, right? It's not the French or the British Empire. It's something much more profound in that respect. And this phase of colonization of refugees ends in 1948, when the state is built and it becomes quite powerful very quickly, builds a strong army, evicts about 60 or 70% of the Palestinians, destroys between 400 and 500 villages of the Palestinians, and create what we call the Nakba. And this is, in today's terms, we would call it ethnic cleansing. And it was, of course, very profound. But then Israel was accepted to the UN on the basis of these borders, and it appears like the situation was stabilized. But the next stage, in 1967, Israel actually overtook the whole of Palestine, which, you know, in the past was conquered by Jordan and by Egypt. And ironically, which often happens in history, with an attempt to kill Palestinian nationalism, actually Israel revived it. There wasn't much Palestinian nationalism. But in 1967, the three big parts of the Palestinian people got reunited under Israeli regime: Gaza, Palestinians in Israel, and the West Bank. And so it's not surprising that Palestinian nationalism started to emerge again, this time from the land itself, and that was the first Intifada, and that was the third stage that moved into the Oslo Agreement and the attempt to perhaps create some peace. I never considered it peace. I was almost thrown out of my university when I signed a petition against Rabin and Arafat getting the Nobel Prize for Peace, because we wrote, there was only 11 of us in the whole of Israel, including Edward Said. We said there is no peace. Why give them the Nobel Prize for Peace? But anyhow, it did signal a new stage that Israel started to retreat from territories, from Palestinian territories. It was significant. It wasn't peace. But we see now, 20 years later, that it was a different way to actually colonize Palestine. A different, you know, it was sort of partial retreats to consolidate other parts first and foremost, the settlements. And the Jewish settlement in the West Bank, now they are numbering more than 500,000 people, all under this umbrella of going for peace, under the retreat, significant retreats from Lebanon, from Gaza. Zionism is, losing its dominance. It's consolidating, but it's consolidating a system of domination. So what appeared to be maybe a movement for peace was stopped by the assassination of our Prime Minister Rabin, and Serbians would know all about assassination of leaders, and also by the incessant, successful, effective work of the most purposeful and organized sector of Israeli society, which is the settlers. They don't stop. They settle and settle and settle. And from a small group, during Oslo Agreement, it was only 100,000 settlers. Now there's more than 500,000. And it appears like a situation, a lot of people say it's irreversible. And this is the situation where I call the fifth stage, which is not two states, but not one either, right? It's the Israeli state and pockets of some kind of Palestinian autonomy and ongoing colonization. And ongoing colonization in various parts in the West Bank and also inside Israel proper. What's happening in the Negev now, actually in these very few weeks, is a new law that is passed to remove Bedouins from the land. It's called the Prof law. Like Orly said, it started to hit the news. We went to the European Parliament, we went to the United States. There's a lot of mobilization. The UN has declared that this is an illegal law, but Israel is pressing with it. And it's colonization, internal colonization. So these are the stages. And within that, I want to highlight two concepts of ethnocracy and gray space. Ethnocracy we already talked about, but I think it explains quite a lot of the regime that has happened, where a state is actually appropriated by one ethnic group, one dominant ethnic group. It actually reigns the state to continue an ethnic project of expansion, not just territorially, also in terms of economic power, in terms of political power, in terms of legal power. The state is an instrument of one group. Now that group is often a dominant group within the majority, because it has other groups within the majority, but it's the elites among the majority, and it works up a strategy of continuing, of making it impossible for the other groups to enter the realm of power through all kinds of manipulations of law and space. And this is where Israel-Palestine is a very good example. The thing with ethnocracy is usually it's not a sustainable situation. And in other ethnocracies that I studied, for example, Estonia and also Sri Lanka, and Northern Ireland is perhaps the best example, it got to a dead end. And rather than turning into apartheid, for example, Northern Ireland democratized. And Israel is now in this kind of situation. It's in that kind of junction. Gray space is what I worked on the last 3 or 4 years, is the idea of, what I call it is the management of the unwanted irremovable. Okay? This is what happened now all around the world. Israel, again, is leading the way, in a way, of devising ways of managing unwanted populations, but populations that are not removable. First and foremost, the Palestinians, but also in Israel now hundreds of thousands of foreign laborers, mainly from Africa, but also from Asia, also from Eastern Europe, that Israel needs them, but it needs to also be against them. So they're for them and against them. There's a whole lot of populations that are neither included nor excluded. And when I do my current project of cities around the world, of metropolitan areas, be it Lagos, Cairo, Istanbul, Cape Town, Colombo, we see this again and again. The cities draw a lot of populations. They're not citizens, but the city and the economy needs them. And sometimes they come there even if they're not needed. They find their way. In South America, they actually very typically build their own cities. They call the favelas or the barrios. And this is a new order. And Israel-Palestine, as you'll see, again, is very much at the forefront of that, especially Jerusalem, Beer-Sheva, where I live. Beer-Sheva, the dominant Jewish group, is the minority now in terms of space, not in terms of numbers still, but in terms of space, it's surrounded by slums, shanty towns, spontaneous Bedouin cities. And this is a thing, concept that will help us understand what's happening. How am I going for time? No, how much longer? 10 minutes more? 15 minutes, okay. So these are just some examples. This is a commercial break of the various books. And this is the book that came with Harvard Press that I did with Ahmad Amara and Ismail Abu Saad about indigenous injustice, which is more or less legal geography. And this is a recent article of people interested about the election that I call it liberal colonialism. This is, again, an interesting concept because in Israel you see these two things strengthening at the same time. The liberalism of Israeli society and at the same time the colonization, which are supposedly in contradiction to one another. But Israel, in the main urban center, is very liberal. There's freedom, there's tolerance, there is gay rights are very prominent, there is, and yet if you just go 10 or 15 kilometers from there, it's harsh apartheid. So think about it all happening in the same system, and this just published 2 or 3 weeks ago. And if I analyze, this is from this article, the Israeli elections from the 1980s onwards, and I divide it into 3 geopolitical blocks. This is the colonial bloc. This is the ethnocratic bloc. This is, supposedly interested in Israel and Palestine side by side. And this is the democratic liberal bloc. You see the way they fluctuate over time, and the way there was one particular period of time where there was a majority, if you take this together, the majority to end Israeli colonization. It was during the Olmert time and Sharon, previous prime ministers. There was also a draw situation during Rabin. Rabin was here, and it was 60-60. He managed to form a government by buying one of the opposition people to cross into the government and giving him a nice car. That was at the time, and it created a majority, but it didn't last. So overall, you see that the colonial bloc, that is the groups in Israel that are interested in colonizing Palestine, is managing to hold the majority. In the last election, very, very slim majority, 61 out of 120, but it is structural. It is structural. Why? A, because there is a group that continues that project. B, because Israel is not paying the price. The international community is doing virtually nothing for Palestine. Not the Arab world, not the international community. They're allowing Israel to do this. But at the end, I would say, because we're moving into an apartheid system, there's no other way to do it. This backfires also, could backfire for the Jews as well. And you see that there is a persistent democratic liberal bloc, but it's consistently quite small. These are just some signs from the last election. And as a geographer, I have to show you maps, right? So this is interesting, and in that respect, quite rare around the world, where the conflict between groups is about the entire territory. You won't find many such conflicts. Northern Ireland was another one, right? The Catholics wanted to be part of the Republic of Ireland. The Protestants want the whole of Northern Ireland to be part of Britain. It happened maybe with Cyprus too, where the Greeks want the Enosis to be a part of Greece, and the Turks wanted it to be annexed to Turkey. But most of the conflicts around the world, including the Balkans, are not about the whole territory. Kosovo wants Kosovo. It doesn't want Serbia, right? And the same with most of the other elements. Israel-Palestine, it's not all the time in all the periods, but both nations, the Zionists and the Palestinians, are interested in the whole land. And this makes it even more problematic. You see that with the maps everywhere, the Israeli maps in the schools and on the everywhere is including the whole land, like I showed you before. The green line, which is the official border of Israel, is not allowed to be on any official map. This is a diktat of the Israeli government, right? And this is a school. This is actually my daughter's school. This is on the wall all the time. The kids see that. All the names are in Hebrew. And here the designer also made the land, which is female in Hebrew, a little bit wider in the hips, so she looks a little bit better, right? But it is all Hebrewized. You see the reverse in the Palestinians. The Palestinian logos, imaginations, is all about the whole land being Palestine. Both, obviously, the Hamas, which is the Islamic Brotherhood, which has this image on its symbol, although it's minor compared to religion and the safe, the sword. But also the PLO has this emblem, the whole land. So this is a deep conflict about the whole land. And increasingly, even leaders, both Jewish and Palestinian leaders, keep saying that this is going to be just one land. Reuven Rivlin, one of the prominent leaders of the Likud, has recently said the land is not divisible. And many people join him. Now there is a caucus in the Knesset of 40 Knesset members that have declared there will not be a Palestinian state, almost all of them from the government. So that's also an interesting thing that Netanyahu is saying, well, I support a Palestinian state without saying borders, without saying what sovereignty, without saying anything. But he says that for international audiences. And his people, his coalition, form a caucus that this will never happen. And of course, the Hamas continue to have its, you might want to call it a reverse colonization program. With Khaled Mashal, for example, say that we cannot cede an inch to Israel. This is the whole of Israel has to be turned back into Palestine. Hamas also speaks sometimes more pragmatically. The main Palestinian leadership is still behind the two-state solution, but the popular support for it is decreasing all the time. This is actually a rare map which portrays the actual geography of Israel-Palestine. Most of the maps that you see are ideological. They portray a desired solution, or they try to make it look worse. This actually shows the green areas are Palestinian control. The white areas are land that is become Jewish or Israeli land. The red dots are Israeli settlements, Jewish Israeli settlements, and this light green is Palestinians inside the green line, and here is the Bedouin areas. The dark greens are Palestinians in area A and B, the vast majority of the Palestinians in area A and B in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, interestingly, you see the population there is almost equal. There's about 51% of the population is Jewish and about 48% is Palestinians. And of course, if you think about the Palestinian refugees coming back, as they should, it would be an Arab majority. And this is a big factor in there. What's interesting for me here is the white area. I did a big study of the land regime. And the white areas are all land that have been declared state land. State land for the Jewish state means land for the Jews. And they cover 85% of the land. So the Palestinians, who are almost 50% of the population between the Jordan and the sea, they only control 15% of the land, 1/5. And this is one of the most profound and effective system of control because people come to the courts and they come to the committees and they say, well, we'd like to help you, but this is not your land. You have to get out because the courts have declared this is state land. And state land means Jewish land. Not theoretically, but practically that's what it means. And it's a very elaborate system, and I'm very interested in comparing it to what happened in Serbia. I give sort of a little progression. See, 1917, less than 100 years ago, there were very few Jews, only about 6% of the population. And then 1947, it was already 33% of the population, but the Jewish land was covering only about 10% of the land. This is colonization of refugees. That's what they managed to buy. Then after 67 or whatever, after 48, it actually, Jewish settlements continue unabated inside the Green Line, and after 67, beyond the Green Line in the Palestinian territories, and 2011, Israel has built 1,100 settlements, Jewish settlements, which is, as I calculated, the highest number of settlements per capita in the world. All the time, and there's all the time new settlement program. Palestinian geography that was in 1947 scattered with about 700 villages and about 12 cities in the Nakba is shrunk, and you could see all these Palestinian areas just disappeared. All the villages were demolished, and the Palestinian refugees moved to Jordan, Syria, West Bank, and Gaza. And you can see that effect very powerfully. And since then, really, since 1967, the Palestinian geography has frozen. Jewish geography continues to expand. The Palestinian geography inside Israel and in the West Bank is frozen. Israel is not allowing the Palestinian hardly any expansion, let alone to build new settlements. So this is a big part of it. And in my research, I try to, and I've written quite a lot about it in this simplified way, to look at how the land system affected. And I'm very interested to know whether Serbia or whether in the Balkans there is this kind of regime. I didn't find any articles about it, and if people have some, please direct me to them, because a lot of it draws on the Ottoman period. And dead land, mawat, is an Ottoman category that was for land that is uninhabited, uncultivated, possessed by no one. And later, the British made dead land considered state land. And this is a trick that Israel got into through that. And basically half the lands, even more than half the lands, about 60% of the land that is state land, in the Israeli courts, it comes through this category of dead land, right? And I can explain, I've written a lot about it, how they did it, how they came up with this legal doctrine, which is very sophisticated and very hard to fight against because it has particular dates like 1858 and 1921, and people were supposed to do certain things, and if they didn't do it, the land automatically, supposedly, comes to the state. Maybe 100 years later, they come to people now in the West Bank and they said to them, you didn't know about it, and your father didn't know about it, but your grandfather was a trespasser into that land, right? In, say, 1880. So we have to take the land from you. We're sorry, right? And that's how they evict people from the land. And the legal system does it, but also conceals it. This is what's brilliant about legal systems. They actually force you off the land, but then when you come to appeal, they say it's all legal. I'm sorry. So they also hide the crime. And this is where this kind of legal system is very sophisticated under dead land. The two categories of dead land, one is mawat and one is mahlul. I can elaborate if people want later. This is beyond the whole idea of confiscating the refugee land, which is another huge factor, which is about 20% of the land of Israel is Palestinian refugee land, but it's much less than mawat land, right? And with refugee land, this is saying, well, when time of political settlement, like the Balkans, they keep saying, the people in Israel say, like the Balkans, when they have settlement, peace, we'll do something with this land. In the meantime, we're holding it for the refugees and settle Jews on it. But anyhow, it's held as refugee land. It's much more severe, the dead land category, because then it actually declares that it didn't belong to anybody, even if people sat on it. And this is exactly the idea of terra nullius, you know, that say the Indians in the United States held the land, but they didn't register it, so it doesn't belong to them. Or the Chiapas in Zapatistas in Mexico, or in Africa, or in everywhere where you have indigenous people. And that's why it's interesting to look at it. So the land flows in one direction from Arab land or Arab held land or empty land to Jewish land, and then it's actually allocated to all these settlements. And most recently, and it's very interesting, and this is why it's colonial liberalism, and we won't go into it, it's actually being privatized. But you think privatization is colorblind, but it's not. In Israel, privatization is only for Jews, right? Because you have all kind of mechanisms that screen people out, and by and large, 99.9%, not 100%, but 99.9%, it allows only Jews access to this privatized land. Or maybe international investors. For example, Russian oligarch can buy the land. That's okay. They can build towers on it, etc. But not Arabs or Palestinians. So this is a system that I think is very important. And of course, what it creates is the foundation of the creeping apartheid, of all these enclaves of people under the same government, under the same power, but their identity and their location decides their rights, and their rights are unequal, right? So I'll skip a bit. in the interest of time, and just give you a brief look, very brief look at the Bedouin people of Beer-Sheva. This is the map of the Beer-Sheva region, the Beer-Sheva metropolitan, recent Beer-Sheva metropolitan plan. You see how nice it is. You have inner ring, middle ring, outer ring, it all according to all the textbooks. And this is an aerial photograph of the same region. And you see all these unrecognized settlements. These are the Bedouin people sitting around the metropolis. Many of them sit on their ancestors' land, and they declared invaders, so the state is not providing them with any services. They try to concentrate them into 7 towns, to urbanize them, and like one of the ministers once said, we save the Bedouins a lot of time. We move them from the camel straight to the factory. You don't have to have all the ways, all the steps on the way. But most of the Bedouins refuse to do it, and they hang on. Some of them on their land, some of them in other. So this is the planned towns for the Bedouins, and you see this is Lakia. And you see in it very big patches of land empty that the state is not able to settle even in the cities because they have land claims, traditional land claims that no Arab will go and live on a land that another Arab claims according to the traditional law. And this is what most of it looks around Beer-Sheva. You see these people, they just hang on to the ancestors' land, but the state says, because you're illegal, we're not going to give you water, electricity, roads, buses, schools, anything. So hundreds of thousands of people live that way. And you can see the Jewish city there. That is a modern city. Not a bad city. You're all invited. It's quite fun. And this is what it looks like on the hills around. The state is managing it also with constant performance of violence. Last year we had 1,200 house demolitions. Just this morning there were 7 more houses demolished. These people have to rebuild the house on the same place because they don't have any other solution, only if they go to the towns. But they don't want to go to the towns because the towns are a concentration of poverty and also destruction of the traditional way of life. And also they know, and the history of Palestine shows that, one who leaves his land loses it. Okay? So they've learned from the history what the Palestinians call sumud, to hang on to the land, to hang on, even at terrible price, really terrible price, and they will rebuild those many, many times. I was fortunate enough to be invited by the Bedouin villages in the last 3 years, from 2009 to 2012, and we did a comprehensive alternative plan, master plan for the Bedouin villages. We showed, and we went to the media, etc. And just 2 weeks ago, I was in the Knesset showing that according to all planning criteria, you can recognize all the Bedouin villages, all of them. And all of them are larger than the Jewish settlements, or many of the Jewish settlements. Not all, but many of the Jewish settlements are very small. Some of them, what we call ma'achazim, sometimes have 20 or 30 people. And our villages are all from 300 people above. Some of them are 6,000 or 7,000 people. They're not villages, they're towns. So we did a map and calculation and economics and demography and land laws, and we showed that it's possible. And now it's a little bit harder for the government because they always ask when they try to promote this law, what about the alternative plan? The alternative plan showed that it's possible, and it's also much cheaper for the government not to evacuate the people. Every house demolition, for example, takes between 100 and 300 police or border patrol people. It's hugely expensive. So it could not just be more just and more logical, but also cheaper to keep the villages where they are and develop them. But so far we haven't managed to convince the government, but we'll see what happens. At least it's an alternative. This is just to show you, this is the latest plan of the Jewish agency, Chativa L'Yateshvut. It's not the Jewish agency, etc. What is it? The Jewish Federation, to have 10 more settlements around Beer-Sheva, Jewish settlements, at the time where they're trying to evacuate the Bedouins. So you see what I talk about, this kind of separate and unequal. So to sum up, to round up, what emerged after 65 years of Israel-Palestine is 4 types of citizenships. Okay? This is the packages of rights and capabilities that allow people to build their lives. So Jews, of course, also divided into many groups, and Jewish society is not equal inside, but nonetheless, they have full citizenship. Whether it's religious, whether it's immigrant, whether it's Russian, whether it's Ashkenazi, they have various types, Mizrahim, Jews, but they have de jure full citizenship. Then you have the Palestinian Arabs inside Israel. They have theoretically full citizenship. Nobody would say that they have partial citizenship, but if you check the laws of Israel and the material condition, they have second-class citizenship. For example, immigration to Israel is only by Jews. Arabs cannot immigrate to Israel. They cannot marry other Arabs and bring them to Israel, even under the Israeli government. And the land laws work against them, and they've never been part of the government. They've always been marginalized. It's definitely institutionalized. There's never been a new Arab settlement in Israel, except to concentrate the Bedouins. But the Palestinian Arabs themselves were never allowed to build a new say, nice town or something like this. And then you have Palestinian Arabs in the occupied territories, which also have various parts. Gaza is not the same as West Bank. East Jerusalem is not the same as West Bank. But overall, it's a different class of citizenship. It's citizenship without citizenship, right? It's just residents, really, or subject of the Israeli regime, or sometimes under double system of control because they have a Palestinian government that controls various enclaves without real sovereignty controlling them, and then Israel controls the Palestinian authorities. And then you have emerging another category of labor migrants and refugees that already in hundreds of thousands, and as I said, not really included, but also not driven away. And all this system is institutionalizing. Of course, it's not neat and nice like on this diagram. It's full of contradictions and boundaries that sometimes are broken, but overall, it's over the years institutionalizing into a system that I call creeping apartheid. And I'm not the only one that says that. Ehud Olmert, Prime Minister of Israel, a few years ago said that the creation of a Palestinian state is a vital Israeli interest. Failure to reach peace agreement and create a viable Palestinian state would plunge Israel into a South African-style apartheid struggle. We are very close to such a moment. Okay, so many people are saying this sort of as a warning, and I would like to put to dress it up as a way into which ethnocracy develops almost naturally if it doesn't correct itself. Okay, in Northern Ireland at the time, they talked about Protestant apartheid. In many places around the world where, say, southern United States, when ethnocratic rules prolonged for a long time, it became what we call today apartheid. People are classified according to their identity with different legal system and different legal rights. And this is where Israel-Palestine is moving now, and ethnocracies have the tendency to do that, but they can also correct themselves. And I formed a group now and that's to round off. What is the possible way forward? Group of Israeli Palestinians that have looked at the two dominant discourses that exist, and the two dominant discourses are two states or one state. The official international law, international community, everybody supports the two-state solution, and this is why the leaders talk that way, Abbas and Netanyahu, etc. They speak into the ears of what people want to hear. This is untenable on the ground. It's impossible to have two states for two people with 500,000 Jews in the West Bank, with 1.5 million Palestinians inside Israel, and with such a small land, and with Palestine divided into Gaza and the West Bank, and with the special status of Jerusalem. It's almost like a pipe dream. And more so, if it's enforced, and it's possible that it might be enforced like Bosnia, like Dayton. If it's enforced, it will not be a resolution. It very, very quickly will cause new ways of conflict because it will not resolve the main issues. It will not resolve the refugee issue. It will not resolve the security issue of the Jews, which is very important. It will not resolve Jerusalem. It will not be a stable situation. And when we know how ethnic politics work and how ethnocratic societies tend to mobilize to the right, or tend to have a race to who is more nationalistic, who is more violent, who is more supporting the rights of the right people, we know that this kind of escalation is just a matter of time. When you have such a small, belligerent, surrounded Palestinian state, it will not be able to be sustainable. On the other hand, the one-state solution, which people jump, is also untenable. This is because it runs against international law of the right of self-determination, which is so important. It means that Israel will disappear. Okay? The one-state solution means that Israel will disappear because, as we said, the minute refugees start to come back, the Palestinians will be a majority, and it will be natural and obvious for them to vote in the parliament or whatever, that the nature of the state becomes an Arab state or a binational state with an Arab majority, and et cetera, et cetera. It will be a natural progression that Israel will disappear. Also, as a state, it will disappear. It will be Israel-Palestine. And with all my critique of Jewish nationalism and ethnocracy, I don't think that one throws the baby with the bathwater. That is, Israel has a right to exist. It is, take away all the war crimes and the colonialism. It could be a legitimate state, much like Serbia, after it corrected itself. So the idea was, actually, a lot of Palestinians have started to talk about it, and I've written a few articles already 10 or 15 years ago about Confederation. And we came together now, and we have a group that is called One Land, Two States, or Two States Without Partition, that talks about having two sovereign areas, but releasing the whole idea of pure space. It doesn't have to be pure space. The Palestinian state can have many Jews. The Jewish state can have many Palestinians. Because of the confederation idea is that people can be affiliated to each side. You have a joint council that manages natural resources and immigration and the economy. You have one currency. And you have various communities underneath. The idea is not to evict anybody. The idea is to let people stay where they are and legalize the system and manage to move forward with minimum injury. The main idea will be political and legal change rather than geographical change. That means recognizing all the Bedouin communities. That means allowing the Jewish settlers to stay in Palestine and to have their status guarded. In the last B'Tselem report that we did, we actually analyzed the area of the settlements. The Jewish settlement in the West Bank only occupy 1.5% of the land. This is the built-up area. It's very small, right? If you take out all the fences and all the local government that they artificially put on the map, the actual settlements are very small. I would imagine that if there is a Palestinian state, many of them would prefer to leave, but those that want to stay, and of course under Palestinian law, it's a possibility, I think, that will minimize the situation. Confederation is open, freedom of movement. Jerusalem is a joint capital. And it's to some extent a way to reintegrate the land without actually doing away with the idea of Palestine and Israel. So we see that over time, the Joint Council, for example, that is quite thin in the beginning, maybe a little bit like in Europe, the idea of the European Union started with coal and metal trade, right? It was a very, very modest beginning, but it thickened itself up, possibly maybe too much now. So much so that even Croatia wants to join, which is a bit strange. But it did start jointly, modestly, and we think that over time the cooperation can thicken many other realms of life that binational management can include. Both in Israel and in Palestine, there will be many communities and devolution of power to communities. The military can also be reduced because it will not be needed. At the moment, it's such a strong institution vis-a-vis the Palestinians. But when there is no conflict and no terror, the military too will gradually, of course, not disappear, but become less important. This is where we started to even we're going to come up with the documents. We started to actually even work on a logo, which is always a good sign. One land, two states, bilad wahada wa dawlatayn. And this is an attempt to, of course, reach the end of colonization, to reverse to some extent this process, to allow the land to belong to the two people in a daily way of shopping, of working, of living, but formally still to have two sovereign areas. So this is, to some extent, maybe optimistic, you would say, but this is a horizon can be developed as a political and legal geographer. But all the analysis in the world, of course, can never equal the word of a poet. So I decided to end with two poems that describe a lot of the story of Israel and Palestine. So Mahmoud Darwish, you probably all heard about. He wrote a poem that's called Yawmiyat al-Jarh al-Falastini, the diary of a Palestinian wound. And he said, O Jarh al-Mukaber, watani laysa hakiba, fa'ana laysa musafir, ana al-ashik wal-balad al-mahbuba. I think that's right. So he's saying that my homeland is not a suitcase. Precisely at the moment, of course, that he becomes a refugee. But he tried to assert to us that it is there, it will be there, and it will never be forgotten. And it remains a loved one that will never be forgotten. Answers to him, Yehuda Amichai, a very, both of them now recently died, actually, both these great poets. And he talks about the place. And he says, במקום בו אנו צודקים לא יפרחו עוד באביב פרחים. המקום בו אנו צודקים הוא קשה ורמוס כמו חצר. אך ספקות ואהבות הופכות אותו לתחוח, כמו מחרשה, כמו חפרפרת, ולחישה תשמע במקום בו עמד הבית שנחרב. So the place where we are righteous, which is so typical to ethnocratic society, they're always very righteous, right? No flowers will bloom there in the spring. The place where we are righteous is hard and trampled like a yard, but doubts and love make it ground like a plow, like a mole, and a whisper, not a shout, a whisper will be heard in the place where the demolished house once stood. So this kind of humanistic approach of the land, of whispering, of remembering the demolished houses, of actually allowing, opening it up to both the suffering and the hopes of the people. On this, I rest my case. Thank you.
My question is sort of about drawing a comparison between Kosovo and Serbia and on the possible resolution in Israel, considering the Israel-Palestinian case. So I attended a lecture by the Kosovo's prime minister, and he was asked, because there are majority Serbian villages now in Kosovo complaining and not accepting the sovereignty, the state sovereignty, the new state sovereignty. He was asked, considering the fact that we are in the 21st century and that the Weberian kind of state sovereignty is kind of outdated, whether some concessions could be made to the authority to the new Kosovo's authority, and he was like, no, never. This is our state. We gained independence. So I think my question is, do you think that politicians holding on to the Weberian conception of state sovereignty will provide an issue in the Israeli-Palestinian case?
Oh, very good question. I think it will. It will definitely be there, and this is why we're trying, if you like, to square the circle with this idea, is that sovereignty will be there. Only that you might want to think of Kosovo and Serbia in a confederational arrangement, perhaps like Montenegro was for a while, and that there are real benefits for both sides. Of course, there have to be real benefits for both sides from this idea. There's obvious benefits for the Palestinians from confederation. It makes the country accessible. It makes Gaza and West Bank joint, and the Palestinians in Israel. There's less benefits for Jews, perhaps, but one huge one is the idea of the settlers. People they don't know what to do with the settlers. I mean, Israel is a powerful state, but as I said, first of all, it harbors incredibly injurious and traumatic memories, which can be always played up in the public discourse. So evacuating settlements immediately becomes a new Holocaust, as you can imagine, or Iran doing whatever. So this will be a benefit for Jews if they don't have to deal with evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. Of course, many of them, as I said, will leave, but they can offer them housing, etc. And the idea of Palestine becoming a Kosovo, I think, is less likely because of the geography of the Palestinian people, that most of them are outside the West Bank, and also because of the great benefits of joining Israel. And this has to be said. Israel is a very successful economy. The Palestinians have incredible incentive to, the Palestinian GDP is something like $2,500, and Israel is about $30,000. This huge difference between the economies. So Palestinians, most of them, and it's been shown in the past, they want to work in Israel. They want to have economic development through association. And with the one economy, confederations usually have one economy, that could supposedly make a difference, because Kosovo and Serbia are not all that different, and Kosovo doesn't have that much of an interest or the gap to close up to Serbia. But it could well be that if a Palestinian state is established, that the Weberian, I'm not sure it's exactly good to call it Weberian, because Weber was much more open than that, but the ethnocratic idea of two ethnocracies, that's quite likely. And if it will be at the cost of evacuating the Jewish settlers, West Bank will be, I think, of course, it's hard to predict, but I think it will be similar to Gaza. Okay, so it will be a great victory of the radical Palestinians. It will be a radical regime. And you know what happens in that, this partition, I think, will be unstable. And of course, that will mean that the Jewish radicals will also prevail, because radicals bring the radicals. Think about what happened, Amud Anan, when was it? This year, right? Yeah, December or January, no, December 2012. Think about Israel bombed Gaza, bombed the hell out of Gaza, right? Now, the two parties in the Israeli government then, Israel Beitenu, the right-wing sort of Russian party, and the Likud, had a coalition agreement. In the coalition agreement, it says that the goal of this coalition is to annul the Hamas, to make the Hamas disappear. Now, Israel goes to war against the Hamas. Supposedly everything that they wanted. Of course, there is almost no resistance except bombing and terrorizing Israeli civilians, which is quite severe, but nonetheless, it's not a military threat. And then they stop. After 6 days, they stop, right? What does that mean, right? That the radical right-wing Israelis, they need the Hamas. They don't want the Hamas to disappear, right? This is the raison d'etre. They need the Hamas to continue to be there. And this is what will happen in the West Bank too, if likely will happen if Israel retreats grudgingly, if the Palestinians evict the Israeli settlements and create an ethnocratic Palestinian state. It's their right. I'm not saying it's not their right. It's absolutely their right internationally. But I think Confederation offers something better for the two nations.
Hello, I am Matan. I'm from Tel Aviv. Thank you for an inspiring and fascinating lecture. Most of the things I agree, but I have a few reservations or questions. I think in many ways your proposal or the plan that you come with is in a way returning to 1947 and to the plan of separating the two nations, but in sort of cooperation in terms of currency, in terms of many other functions of a state that will remain together. And I think it's a return to 1947 also in the sense that there comes a group of experts who bring to the population the best, and it might be the best solution, what you offer. But the question that needs to be asked is whether, is how do we make people agree that this is what is good for them? And here when you ask Palestinians or Jews in Israel-Palestine, many of them, I don't know how many, but I guess that most, the vast majority will refuse this proposition. And they will go for what you're calling ethnocracy, which is bad. I honestly think that the only viable solution could be a binational solution of some sort. But what we need to think, what I am preoccupied in this regard is how do we make a binational solution how do we make the populations, the Jews and Palestinians and all the rest, agree that some kind of a binational solution is best for them? And what is the best binational solution in this regard? I mean, what binational solution would be most acceptable for both populations?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a right observation. I think it does have echoes of UN Decision 181, which was in 1947 the partition plan to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Historically, it was disastrous in terms of what transpired, and because the Palestinians were so weak, and as you know, the Arab League really spoke for the Palestinians, and you know how it is when someone from the outside makes a very rejectionist position. The Arab League looked very good. They banned the UN. They rejected the partition plan. And who suffered? The Palestinians, right? So it continues to be that way. But the 181 decision was quite smart. If you read it, beyond the two lines that the politicians said, if you actually sit and read it, it says two states with an economic union and with a joint capital. And the joint capital was corpus separatus. It was actually managed internationally, the important city of Jerusalem, which, as you know, in 2003, I think that was the UN year of the city, and they did a survey around the world, and Jerusalem was by far the most recognized city in the world. So it's the quintessential global city. And it has to be managed very carefully and not by ethnocratic forces. So it was a very smart decision, but it was rejected by the Arabs. It was also it was accepted officially by the Jews, but the Jews immediately conquered they didn't stay in the land, the UN. They conquered further territories. So on the ground, it was also not abided by. But I accept that it is the reintroduction of the same idea, but with two very important differences. First, it's almost the only international decision that both leaderships, both national movements have agreed on. The Jews in real time, and the Palestinians in 1988 declared they accept, and until now, they accept the UN Decision 181. Okay, so it's quite rare that the decision is agreed by two sides. Secondly, the historical dynamic momentum is very different, okay? At the time, it was partitioning what appeared to be, from the Palestinian perspective, cruelly partitioning an existing land, a bit, like a fresh axe coming into the table, like in India or in other places. And at the moment, if this happens, it's actually reintegrating. It's opening it on the land, it's making Palestinian rights, it's actually making a joint capital. So the dynamic is to reintegrate. Now, in terms of popular support, of course, it's a fair point, but I wouldn't be so sure. First of all, this kind of proposal is never on the table, hasn't been on the table. Nobody's entertained it. We started to now in our group. We haven't even come up with a publication yet. We just go from forum to forum, from the Ramallah people, we go to some people in Hebron, Bethlehem, then we go to some groups like generals in Israel. Everybody's very, very interested, okay? The other thing is that you're right that most Israelis now, after many, many years, most Jews support the two-state solution, about 70%. In the past, Oli would also know that we got arrested in the 80s or in the 90s when he even talked about it and appeared with PLO. It was illegal to appear with PLO people. So we used to sit on the stage and have a wall in between. Remember, a cardboard wall that we don't really know one another. This is very recent. 20 years ago, it's only 10% supported two-state. The Jews have accepted, by and large, not the very right wing, but most Jews. But the Palestinians have, the support for the two-state solution has declined and declined, and in most surveys of the Palestinian people, not in the West Bank, of the entire Palestinian population, it stands at about 30%. So most Palestinians now would be more willing to have different solution, the two-state solution, not giving away Palestinian national rights, but perhaps looking at this. And I think in that kind, this is binationalism. Binationalism in various ways. It's not a binational state as one state, but it is binationalism everywhere, both in the Palestinian area and in Israel and in various cities like Beer-Sheva, Jerusalem, Haifa. So I agree with you, this is where we have to go, but I would say that Israelis will never agree to the disappearance of Israel. No country will agree to its disappearance. So this is the red line where we cannot go beyond. But apart from that, the possibilities are open to new agendas and innovative ways forward, which is based on equality.
Hi, my name is Miguel from Portugal. I'm taking your course. I have a couple of critical remarks. The first one being that I find it somewhat incoherent that you describe this whole process of settlement and colonization from the 40s, and then you say that after all of this, that you still want to have an Israel national state, or at least an Israeli self-determined state. I think that it doesn't really make much sense if you defend the two at the same time. And the other remark is you defend confederal solutions in both the case of Serbia and Israel. And empirically, throughout history, confederations and federations have been either disintegrated or centralized. This is the norm. There are very, very few that survive, and least of all in the Middle East. So how would you justify it then? Thank you.
Okay, good comment. I look critically at Israeli settlements, but as a way of moving forward, creating a horizon, you know, you have to sometimes move from colonial to post-colonial. The Portuguese in Brazil were never evicted. They created a new Brazil, hopefully now democratic, under Lola and under Dilma maybe, yeah? But in the whole world, when it moved to post-colonial, the norm is usually the New Zealand, the Peruvian, the South Africa, and the Northern Ireland. The exception is Algeria, okay, where all the settlements are evicted. So I would think that it will be preferable, while of course criticizing and compensating fully the land that was taken and the injury that was caused. Israel has to compensate for it. But the solution is not evicting all of them. It will not create a momentum of reconciliation or a genuine post-colonial democratic order. And when I look around the world, there are better examples of the colonialist and the locals stay and create a new polity. That's one thing. The other thing is you talked about, remind me the second part? The second part of your question was? Confederation. You're right that the historical record of Confederation is a bit iffy. There are not that many, but there are some very successful ones. You know, Switzerland and Canada, for example, all began as confederations. They had different states. Canada is, you know, still with Quebec and with the indigenous people, and Switzerland too. You know, begins with the civil war, etc., between the Germans and the French, and create the canton system, and with a loose kind of government. There's several others. I don't look at Bosnia, for example, as a failure. I think I told Orly today the Bosnians don't shoot and don't kill one another since Dayton. It created some kind of a confederation supported by an international or by a European support, but it is starting to integrate and started to normalize a situation where some kind of unity or sharing in diversity. You can look at many other systems around the world and the European Union, of course, it's a giant, but it's based on this idea. And there are some failures. We have to look at the failures that existed with Confederation breaking up or Federation breaking up. But I would sign today that Israel-Palestine becomes a Belgium, you know? The Belgians, you know, they fight 25 years over what language will be in one school. They don't shoot, they have economic development, they're So if Israel-Palestine reaches this stage and start to disintegrate like Belgium, I accept it, you know. So it's in a democratic way with open borders, with more symbolic kind of struggle. So, but we have to set our imagination in this direction and then try and work it out for the better, and I think it's possible.
My name is Jovo Bakic, assistant professor at the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Belgrade. And I like your lecture, I have to say, but there is a missing link. But it has struck me that you haven't mentioned at all American role in the Middle East. I mean, it's impossible to talk about Israeli-Palestinian relations or Israeli-Arab relations without mentioning US. And without mentioning US, one cannot talk about Kosovo or Serbia or Bosnia-Herzegovina. So American role was and has been decisive one. And one can only imagine Arabic feelings about American role in the Middle East. And yes, I agree with you. I agree with every sentence you said. However, hatred that most Arabs feel about Israel is, I would say, very dangerous for the future. And if one can imagine that US are not anymore major power in the world, then what would happen with Israel? So yes, I agree with you completely with all your arguments, but this is the missing link.
I think you're right. I mean, Oli only gave me 45 minutes, so I'm a good soldier. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's not just the US. In the last decade, perhaps it's the US, but previously it's also the Soviet Union, and I mentioned Europe. There's obviously nothing, not even Albania anymore exists in isolation, not even North Korea. Of course, as a political geographer, I write quite a lot about it. Israel is now well and truly part of the American empire. It's absolutely a client state of the United States. This is a different lecture, but it's absolutely relevant. The Israeli settlement movement and the military are the #1 obstacle to peace. Hamas maybe is the #2, and the third is the United States. The United States is an obstacle to peace, absolutely. It has vetoed for Israel in the UN 44 times. It vetoed for Israel more times than it vetoed for the United States, for its own sake, right? So Israel is the puppet hanging, no sanctions against Israel, Israel exceptionalism because of the United States, and that is not sustainable. But at the moment, it's holding it. The United States, of course, arms Israel. There's no question about it. But if Israelis and Palestinians did move, like it happened in Oslo, or like the Egyptians and the Israelis, the two breakthroughs for peace, that one of them materialized and one didn't, were without the Americans knowing, right? Dayan and Sadat, etc., met, and it was huge secrecy with the Americans. Washington talks occurred after the Madrid conference in 91, 92. I even went there once as an expert. And at the same time, secrecy, the Oslo talks were held in Oslo without the American knowing. The minute the American took over, it started to fail. So I agree with you, the role of the Americans has been disastrous. They've been very, very instrumental in colonizing Palestine. There is a possibility of moving beyond it. And this is a very, very difficult task because the Israeli elites are very Americanized. Most of the Israelis study in the United States. I tell you that in my academic department, there's 13 professors. I think only 2 of us haven't studied in the United States. So there's all these links that are developed with the United States, and Israel sees itself very much as a part of the American world now, not even Europe, part of the American world. the Israeli culture, preferences, consumerism, shopping malls, housing, all become more and more Americans. You have on the news or in reference, people know very well American heroes. They see American series. They know what Rihanna or Madonna or whatever is even more than Israeli artists now. It's been colonized. We've been colonized by American culture, and that is reflected to colonizing the Palestinians too. But that is not God-given, right? There's possibilities, and I say again, if Israeli and Palestinians from below decide to put an end to this colonial situation, the Americans will not, I think, present this obstacle. You know, they are presenting an obstacle when there is no other initiative on the ground. Yeah, we need the critical analysis of the American power, of other powers also around the world, Arab, Saudi power, etc. This is a topic maybe for next year's lecture. Huh?
I had to go for 5 minutes, so I hope that you didn't already answer this.
Okay.
You said already that it's very important that Israeli people were refugees to Israel. Yeah. So how much do you think that actually what's happening now and through years in Israel, it's how much is it consequence of being victim and victimization of the people?
Well, I think there is, you know, a historical element and then manipulation. It's definitely that, you know, it needs, I suppose, no elaboration that Jews have suffered enormously in the last, you know, in the 19th and 20th century. There's almost no parallel to the suffering of Jews. And this is, it was racism at its utmost expression. So it is there. There is almost no Ashkenazi family in Israel that has not been affected by the Holocaust. And most of the Mizrahim, the Arab Jews, have also their own stories. It's nowhere near as cruel as happened in Europe. But nonetheless, they were discriminated. They were Dimam, they were the Akaliya. You know, they had limitations on them. The worst was in Iraq, where they've more or less been evicted from Iraq. So this stories is only one generation ago. Are still alive, but beyond it there is incredible manipulation. Israel has created the Holocaust industry. Every person that comes to Israel is being taken to all these horrible displays of concentration camps and all the names of the victims and etc. etc. And you know, this is manipulation, and we manipulate our own people. For example, take almost every Jewish pupil of high school goes to trip on the concentration camps in Poland, Germany, etc., Ukraine. My kids actually refused to go, and they were outcast because we talked a lot about it. And my family, also part of my family, gone in the Holocaust. But it's not the right way to go, you know, en masse and to hear speeches by army generals and etc. How this is our lesson to have strong and aggressive Israel. So, I mean, Oli is here. Oli Friedman is a much greater expert on that kind of memory work, but it's there all the time. What I might say that Palestinians too have gone through incredible suffering, and that too in the national culture is very, very prominent. The eviction, the exile, it's almost like when you look at it as, you know, like the people that wrote the Greek mythology, you know, is like the quintessential exilic people of the Jews is moving to what they consider their homeland, and they create the ultimate new exilic people, which are the Palestinians, right? It's almost like the Palestinians are the new Jews in that respect. And you know, it could happen in many other ways. It could be that the Koreans are the new Jews or the whatever, right? But it happened to be the Palestinians that are the new Jews. And their suffering too is very, very much always on the public arena. If some of you saw Muhammad Asaf winning the Arab Idol, right? Just 2 weeks ago, right? A lot of the sympathy to him, he's a good singer too, but a lot of the sympathy to him was because he represented the case of Palestine, the dislocation, the refugeeness, and etc. So that created enormous sympathy for him. So victimhood is very much on the card, and part of my, I suppose, psyche, I hate it. And this is why I went to study urban planning, to offer optimistic way forward, not to always harp at the disasters of the past. So hopefully there will be enough people, and there are many people that are interested in translating or transforming the tragic past into a good future, and it's possible. Israel-Palestine as the meeting place of East and West, as Middle Eastern rich culture with European immigration. Israel-Palestine is the #1 immigrant society in the world. We have even more than Australia and the United States, people that come from 80, 90 countries. It could be a great place. Center for tourism with all the ancient sites in it. Center of 3 big religions. Jerusalem. Come and make it happen with us. Inshallah. Yeah.